The Cheyenne war chief stood before me with 20 armed warriors at his back, his face carved from stone and fury, and spoke words that would change everything. "Wed my cursed daughter, or we kill you where you stand." The campfire crackled against the cold Wyoming night, casting long shadows across the weathered planks of the old barn where Austin Masters sat cleaning his rifle. September 1881 had brought an early chill to the territory near the Bighorn Mountains, and the wind carried the scent of sagebrush and coming snow. Across from him, 15-year-old Owen shifted closer to the fire's warmth, his young face bright with the kind of curiosity that couldn't be contained much longer. The boy had been unusually quiet during their 3-day cattle drive back from Copper Falls, but Austin knew that silence well. He had worn it himself once, back when questions burned hotter than any campfire and the world seemed full of mysteries that only grown men could unravel. Owen reached out to touch the scar on Austin's neck, the one that disappeared beneath his collar. His fingers traced the old wound with the careful reverence of someone too young to fully understand the cost of survival. "When did you get this one?" Owen asked. Austin continued staring at the flames, watching them twist and dance like memories trying to escape the past. 4 full seconds passed before he spoke. When he did, his voice carried the weight of those 2 years like stones in a riverbed. 2 years back," he said. The boy waited, knowing better than to rush a story from a man like Austin Masters. In the 3 years since his parents died in a wagon accident, Owen had learned that Austin measured his words the way a trapper measured pelts. Carefully, precisely, never wasting a single one. "Were you scared?" The question hung in the Wyoming air between them. Austin picked up a stick and prodded the fire, sending sparks spiraling up toward the stars like fireflies seeking escape. Another long pause followed, the kind that made younger men uncomfortable, but which Owen had learned to respect. When Austin finally met the boy's eyes, there was something in his gaze that looked like truth stripped bare. "Every single day for 2 months straight," Austin said. Owen leaned forward, his shadow growing long across the dirt. Austin set down the stick and pulled his coat tighter against the September chill. In the firelight, his face looked older than his 32 years, carved by sun and wind in choices that left marks deeper than any blade. "Summer of 1879, Austin began, his voice settling into the rhythm of storytelling. "I had to make a choice. Marry a woman I'd never seen, a woman they called cursed, or let you starve come winter. We had nothing left, Owen, nothing but debts and a dying ranch." The boy's eyes widened. In all their time together, Austin had never spoken of how they came to own the eastern pastures, how their fortunes had turned from desperate to stable. Owen knew his own parents had died, knew Austin had taken him in, but the details remained as mysterious as the mountains themselves. "What did you choose?" Owen asked quietly. Austin allowed himself the ghost of a smile, barely visible in the flickering light. He gestured toward Owen with one calloused hand, the kind of hand that had held both reins and rifles for more years than the boy had been alive. "You're sitting here with a full belly, aren't you?" The fire popped and settled. Austin reached for his rifle, a Winchester Model 1876, and checked the mechanism with practiced ease. 13 rounds in a weapon that had seen him through more close calls than he cared to remember. The rifle gleamed dully in the firelight, more companion than tool. He set it across his knees and looked out into the darkness beyond their small circle of warmth. Somewhere out there, miles away across the valley floor, lay the ranch he and Kashina had built from desperation and determination. Somewhere beyond that lay the graves of men who had made different choices, paid different prices. "Before I tell you this story," Austin said quietly, "you need to understand something. The world judges people by appearances, by rumors, by fear of what they don't understand. Good people get called evil when they're different. And sometimes a curse is just a lie repeated so many times it becomes truth." Owen nodded solemnly, though Austin suspected the boy didn't yet understand. He would, though. Life had a way of teaching those lessons whether a man wanted to learn them or not. 2 years back, Austin continued, you were 13 years old. I was 30. We rode into Copper Falls on the hottest August day I can remember, looking for work in the copper mines nearby. He paused, remembering the weight of that heat, the way it pressed down like a physical thing. The way Owen had looked then, smaller and thinner, still carrying the hollow look of a child who'd lost everything. Your parents, Rebecca and Thomas, had been dead 6 months. They made me promise before the fever took them that I'd take care of you. Not because I owed them anything, though I did. They'd given me work when I was broke and wounded after the war. But because that's what men do. We don't abandon the families of people who showed us kindness. The words came slowly now, each one measured and placed with care. Austin wasn't a man who spoke of emotion directly. He showed it through action, through the steady presence that had kept Owen fed and safe and educated for 3 years. But tonight, with the fire low and the story demanding to be told, he allowed himself this small vulnerability. Copper Falls wasn't much of a town. Maybe 400 people, 1 sheriff, 3 saloons. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone else's business before breakfast, Austin said. He stood and walked to his horse, a sturdy Appaloosa that had carried him across half of Wyoming. From the saddlebag, he pulled out a leather canteen, took a long drink, then offered it to Owen. The boy drank, then handed it back, his eyes never leaving Austin's face. We needed money desperately. The small ranch your parents left was mortgaged beyond its value. I needed work. You needed a place to sleep that wasn't the hard ground every night. So we found a cheap boarding house, 50 cents for the night, and I went to the saloon to ask about the mines. The memory came back sharp and clear. The smell of whiskey and tobacco smoke, the sound of cards shuffling and coins clinking, the way conversation stopped when he walked in. The way eyes measured him and found him wanting, or dangerous, or both. In the saloon, men were talking about a Cheyenne war chief named Halion. They said he controlled the Northern Valley, had negotiated peace treaties with the territory governor, owned more horses than anyone in Wyoming. They said he was looking for someone, but every man he'd sent for had either refused outright or disappeared into the mountains and never came back. Owen shifted uneasily. Austin sat back down, his movements slow and deliberate. An old cavalry scout, his face scarred from a Comanche arrow years before, pulled me aside. He told me not to take any offer from Halion. When I asked why, he looked at me like I was already dead. He said the war chief had a daughter who was cursed, that she brought death to any man who touched her, that 3 men had tried to court her and all 3 had died within the year. The fire crackled. Austin fed it another piece of dried wood, watching the flames catch and burn. I asked if he'd seen any of this himself. He admitted he hadn't. It was just what people said. Stories that had grown bigger with each telling. I told him that rumors weren't the same as truth. He looked at me like I was a fool, but he didn't say anything else. A long silence followed. Austin let it stretch, let Owen feel the weight of those words. But you took the offer anyway, the boy said. I didn't have a choice, Austin replied simply. Not really. We were down to our last $3. The mines weren't hiring white men that month, said they had enough workers. Winter was coming, and I had you to think about. He paused again, remembering that moment of decision. The way fear and necessity had wrestled inside him until necessity won by simple exhaustion. Before I could decide anything, 6 Cheyenne warriors surrounded me outside the saloon. They weren't hostile exactly, but they weren't friendly either. They told me their chief wanted to see me. They told me to come peaceful or not come at all. So I went. Austin stood and walked to the edge of their firelight, looking out into the vast darkness of the Wyoming night. The stars overhead burned with cold intensity. The same stars that had watched everything unfold 2 years ago. They took me to Halion Settlement. It was built in a valley 30 miles north, protected by ridges on 3 sides. Maybe 200 people lived there, Cheyenne families who'd chosen to stay rather than move to the reservations. They had lodges, corrals, crops growing in irrigated fields. It was permanent, organized, prosperous. He turned back to Owen, his face half in shadow. Halion was waiting in his lodge. He was 58 years old then, tall, over 6 feet, with gray hair and 2 long braids and eyes that seemed to look straight through you. He had presence, the kind that comes from leading people through hard times and keeping them alive. Austin sat back down, his movements slower now, tired. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He looked at me like he was evaluating a horse and said, "I hear you fought in the war." I told him yes, with the Union cavalry. He asked if I was good at staying alive. I told him I was still breathing. He smiled at that, said it was the only qualification that mattered. The fire burned lower. Austin fed it again, his hand steady despite the memories churning through him. Then he told me his daughter needed a husband. Just like that. No explanation, no introduction. "My daughter needs a husband, and you need land and a future for that boy you're raising." I told him I didn't need a wife. He said maybe I didn't need a wife, but I did need a way to survive the coming winter. He said he was offering me 200 acres of grazing land, 50 head of cattle, and a stake in the valley's water rights. All I had to do was marry Kashina. Owen made a small sound, halfway between surprise and understanding. Austin nodded. He knew about you. Knew everything about me, actually. Where I'd served, who I'd fought with, how your parents died. Halion was the kind of man who learned everything about a person before making them an offer. Austin pulled out a small silver coin from his pocket, a trade dollar he'd carried since the war ended. He turned it over in his fingers, letting the firelight catch the worn edges. I asked what was wrong with her. Why would he need to bribe a stranger to marry his daughter? Halion looked at me for a long time, maybe 6 full seconds, before he answered. Austin paused, the memory still carrying weight. He said Kashina was cursed. That when she was born, a rival shaman had prophesied that any man who married her would die before seeing his second winter with her. 3 young men from neighboring tribes had tried to court her anyway, brave warriors who didn't believe in curses. All 3 died within a year. One from a hunting accident, one from fever, one killed by raiders. After the 3rd death, no one would come near her. The words hung in the night air. Owen was transfixed, leaning forward. I asked Halion if he believed in the curse. He said it didn't matter what he believed. What mattered was that his daughter was 24 years old, isolated, treated like poison by her own people. She deserved a chance at a normal life, but no Cheyenne man would give her that chance. So he needed an outsider, someone desperate enough to take the risk. Austin stood again and walked to his saddle, running his hand along the worn leather. Some men changed with the times. Austin kept what worked. I asked what happened if I refused. Halion didn't threaten directly, but he gestured toward where you were being watched by 2 of his warriors outside the lodge. Then he looked back at me. The message was clear enough. The boy swallowed hard. Austin continued, his voice level and measured. I told him I wanted to meet her first, to hear her side of things. Halion agreed, but he made one condition. You would stay in his settlement while I went to see Kashina. She lived separately, in a small lodge a mile from the main settlement. The isolation was her choice, Halion said. She didn't want to bring her curse near the children. Insurance that I would come back, he said. Austin's jaw tightened at the memory, the moment when he'd had to choose between his own safety and Owen's, knowing that either choice could end badly. I knelt down to your eye level that morning. Asked you what you'd do if I didn't come back in 2 days. You told me you'd head south to Fort Laramie and find the territorial marshal, just like we'd practiced. I told you not to trust anyone in the settlement completely. You asked if I would come back. Austin's voice roughened slightly. I didn't answer right away. I looked at you for 5 long seconds, weighing the promise against the danger. Then I told you yes. I promised I'd come back. The memory still carried weight. Austin could see it clearly. Owen standing in that Cheyenne settlement, trying so hard to be brave, to be the man his parents had wanted him to become. Halion and 4 of his warriors rode with me the next morning. 5 miles through rocky terrain, following a creek bed that wound between pine-covered hills. It was September then too, just like now. The aspens were turning gold, and the air had that sharp quality that promises winter. He paused, remembering the journey with perfect clarity. I watched Halion during that ride. He was tense, worried in a way that surprised me. This wasn't the confidence of a man setting a trap. This was the fear of a father who'd run out of options. There's a difference. Owen nodded, understanding that distinction. We reached a small clearing where a single lodge stood beside a stream. Smoke rose from the fire inside. Halion told me to go alone, that Kashina was expecting me. He and his warriors would wait at a distance. Austin's voice grew quieter. I walked to the lodge entrance and called out, announced myself like Cheyenne custom required. A voice from inside told me to enter. So I pushed aside the flap and stepped into the dim interior. The fire crackled. Austin let the pause stretch, building the moment. Kashina was sitting by the fire, her back to me. She wore traditional Cheyenne dress, beautifully decorated with quillwork and beads, but her head was covered by a veil made of soft deerskin. I could see the outline of her shape, the way she held herself with careful stillness. His voice took on a different quality now, something almost reverent. She spoke without turning around. Asked if I'd come to look at the cursed woman, to see if the risk was worth the reward. Her voice was clear, educated. She spoke English perfectly, with only the slightest accent. I told her I'd come to meet her, not to look at her. There's a difference. She was quiet for maybe 5 seconds. Then she said I was more respectful than the others had been. I asked what the others had done. She said they demanded to see her face immediately. Treated her like livestock being evaluated for purchase. Made it clear they were only there for her father's land and didn't care about her at all. Austin sat back down, his eyes distant with memory. I told her I wouldn't lie and pretend I didn't need what her father was offering. I was desperate, had a boy depending on me, needed a future. But I also didn't believe in curses, and I thought she deserved to be treated like a person, not a problem to be solved. She turned then, slowly, still veiled. Even through the deerskin, I could see she was looking at me, studying me. She asked why I didn't believe in curses. I told her I'd seen too much death in the war to think it needed supernatural explanation. Men died from bullets and disease and bad luck. Maybe the 3 warriors had just been unlucky. The fire burned steady now. Austin's voice remained level, without judgment, but also without embellishment. Kashina said something that surprised me. She said she didn't believe in the curse either, but it didn't matter what she believed. The curse was real because everyone treated it as real. She'd been isolated for 6 years, ever since the 3rd warrior died. 6 years of living alone, watching her people fear her, seeing parents pull their children away when she walked past. Owen spoke quietly. What did you say? I asked her what she wanted. Not what her father wanted, not what the tribe expected. What did she want for her own life? Austin paused. She stood up then, moved closer to where I sat. Through the veil, I could see the outline of her face, but no details. She said she wanted what everyone wants, to be seen as a person, to have a purpose, to matter to someone. She said if I married her, she wouldn't expect love. She knew this was a transaction, but she hoped we could at least build mutual respect. The honesty of that moment still resonated. I told her that seemed like a reasonable foundation. Then I did something that seemed to surprise her. I asked if she wanted to remove the veil, or if she preferred to keep it on. Her choice, not mine. Austin's hands tightened slightly around his rifle. She was very still for a long moment, maybe 8 full seconds. Then she reached up and slowly lifted the veil. He stopped there, letting the silence build. Owen was barely breathing. Hellion had told me she was cursed, that men feared to look at her. He'd let me build an image in my mind of what that might mean. But when Kashina lifted that veil, I understood that the curse had nothing to do with her appearance. Austin's voice softened. She was beautiful. Owen, not in a fragile way, but in the way wild places are beautiful. Strong features, dark eyes that held intelligence and pain in equal measure. A scar along her jawline from some old accident that somehow made her face more interesting rather than less. She looked at me with an expression that dared me to flinch, to show disgust, to prove I was like all the others. I didn't flinch. I met her eyes and told her the truth. Her father had lied about what the curse was. She wasn't cursed with ugliness or deformity. She was cursed with other people's fear. The distinction landed heavily. Owen was processing this, understanding the cruelty of it. Kashina's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. She said I was the first person in 6 years to look at her like she was human. Then she told me something that changed everything. Austin leaned forward, his voice dropping. She said the curse wasn't random superstition. It had been created deliberately by a man named Marcus Greer, a white trader who'd wanted to marry her for access to Cheyenne land and trading rights. When Hellion refused, Greer had paid a rival shaman to pronounce the curse. Then Greer had systematically murdered the 3 warriors who courted her, making each death look like an accident or natural cause. The revelation hit like a physical blow. Greer was still operating in the territory, still waiting. He'd told Hellion that no Cheyenne man would ever marry Kashina now, that eventually Hellion would be forced to accept Greer's offer. But Hellion had outmaneuvered him by bringing in an outsider, someone who didn't know the history, didn't fear the curse. And now, Austin said quietly, Greer would be coming for me. That's where the first part of the story ends. Owen, tomorrow night I'll tell you about meeting Marcus Greer, about the choice Kashina and I had to make, and about how a wedding ceremony became the most dangerous day of my life. The second night found them camped near Sweetwater Creek, sheltered from the wind that swept down from the Bighorn Peaks like the breath of something ancient and unforgiving. Owen had asked no questions during the day's ride, but Austin could feel the weight of unspoken curiosity pressing against the boy's silence like water against a dam. They ate salt pork and beans as the sun dipped below the western ridges, painting the sky in shades of copper and blood. When the fire was built and the horses tended, Owen finally broke his silence. What happened after Kashina told you about Marcus Greer? Austin poured coffee from the battered pot, the steam rising in thin wisps that disappeared into the cooling air. He handed Owen a tin cup and settled back against his saddle, arranging his thoughts like a man loading shells into a cylinder. Each one had to fit precisely or the whole mechanism would fail. After Kashina explained about Greer, there was a long silence. The kind that comes when you realize the situation is far more dangerous than you'd imagined. I asked her how certain she was that Greer had murdered those 3 warriors. She said absolutely certain, but she had no proof that would stand up in any white man's court. Cole sipped his coffee, letting the bitter heat center him in the memory. The first warrior, a young man named Swift Horse, died from what looked like a fall from his horse during a hunt. But Kashina said Swift Horse was the best rider in the tribe, could stay mounted on a bucking Mustang better than anyone. The fall didn't make sense. The second warrior, Running Wolf, died from what appeared to be snake bite. Except it happened in early spring when rattlesnakes were barely active, and the bite marks looked wrong. Too deep, too deliberate. The fire crackled and popped. Austin feted another piece of wood, watching the flames catch and burn with that same patient intensity he brought to everything. The third warrior, Standing Bear, was killed by what everyone assumed were crow raiders. He was found with arrows in him, crow-style fletching. But Standing Bear had been scouting alone in Cheyenne territory, miles from where any crow raiding party would logically be. Kashina believed Greer had simply bought crow arrows and used them himself, Knowing everyone would assume tribal warfare, Owen shifted closer to the fire. The temperature was dropping fast the way it does in mountain country, where the thin air holds no heat once the sun disappears. I asked Kashina why her father hadn't gone to the territorial authorities. She gave me a look that made me feel foolish for even asking. She said, "What white lawman would believe a Cheyenne war chief accusing a successful white trader of murder without a single piece of proof? Who would they side with?" Austin's voice carried the bitterness of that truth. She was right, of course. In 1879, a Cheyenne accusation against a white businessman would be dismissed before the words finished leaving their mouth. Justice wasn't blind. It was deliberately looking the other way. He paused, remembering the weight of understanding that had settled over him in that lodge. I told Kashina I needed to speak with her father, that we needed to understand exactly what we were facing. She agreed, but she made one request first. She asked me not to make a decision about the marriage yet, not until I'd met Greer and understood what kind of man he was. She didn't want me walking into danger blind. Austin described how they'd walked back to where Halion waited with his warriors. The war chief's face had been carefully neutral, but Austin had seen the tension in how he held himself, the way his hand rested near his knife. I told Halion I knew about Greer. The old chief's eyes widened slightly, the first crack in his composed exterior I'd seen. He looked at Kashina, and something passed between them, some silent communication built from years of shared struggle. Then he nodded and said we needed to talk somewhere private. They'd ridden to a high ridge overlooking the valley. From there, Austin could see the entire Cheyenne settlement spread below, smoke rising from lodge fires, children playing near the creek, horses grazing in communal pastures. It looked peaceful, pastoral even. But Austin was beginning to understand that appearances concealed darker realities. Halion told me the full story. Marcus Greer had arrived in Wyoming Territory in 1872, 7 years before I got there. He'd started as a legitimate fur trader, built up capital, then expanded into supplying goods to both white settlements and native tribes. He was smart, spoke some Cheyenne, presented himself as a friend to all peoples. Austin's voice took on a harder edge. In 1875, Greer approached Halion about marrying Kashina. She was 20 years old then, and Greer was 42. He claimed to love her, said he wanted to build a life that bridged both cultures. Halion was suspicious but willing to let Kashina decide for herself. She refused Greer immediately, said something about him felt wrong, predatory. The coffee was cooling in Austin's cup. He drank it anyway, needing the ritual more than the warmth. Greer didn't take rejection well. He started spreading rumors that Kashina was promised to him, that Halion was backing out of an agreement. When that didn't work, the curse appeared. A shaman from a rival band, a man with gambling debts who Greer had bought, pronounced that Kashina carried death in her shadow. Within a month, Swift Horse was dead. Owen interrupted quietly. Did people really believe a shaman's curse could kill someone? Belief is a powerful thing, Austin replied. When Swift Horse died right after being pronounced cursed, it seemed to confirm the prophecy. Fear spread faster than wildfire. By the time Running Wolf died, nobody doubted anymore. The curse became real through collective belief, which was exactly what Greer wanted. Kashina became untouchable, isolated, exactly as he'd planned. The manipulation was elegant in its cruelty. Austin had recognized it even then. Halion explained that he'd tried to break the curse's hold by encouraging Cheyenne warriors to court Kashina anyway, to prove the curse was false. But after Standing Bear died, no one would risk it. The tribe began treating Kashina like she was contaminated. Parents forbade their children from going near her. Other women avoided her at the creek. She was slowly being erased from her own community. Austin stood and paced to the edge of their firelight, looking out into the darkness where the creek murmured over stones. That's when Halion made his decision to bring in an outsider. Someone who didn't know the history, didn't share the cultural fear of shamanic curses, might be desperate enough to take the risk. He'd sent word through various trading networks that he was looking for a man of good character who needed a fresh start. 3 men had come before me. He turned back to Owen. The first man listened to the offer, heard about the curse, and rode away the same day. Smart enough to recognize danger when he saw it. The second man agreed initially, but disappeared one night before the wedding ceremony could happen. They found his horse the next morning, but never found him. The third man lasted 3 days before Greer's hired guns ran him off with threats. Tommy leaned forward, caught in the story's grip. I asked Halion why he thought I'd be any different. He said because I had you to protect, which gave me a reason to be brave beyond self-interest. Men fight harder for others than they ever fight for themselves. He'd watched how I was with you, seen that I'd put your welfare ahead of my own.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
That made me the kind of man who might actually stand up to Greer. The war chief's assessment had been accurate, even if Austin hadn't fully realized it at the time. I asked the critical question then, what exactly did Greer want? Just Kashina? Just access to Cheyenne trading? Halion's face went dark. He said Greer wanted the valley. All of it. The Cheyenne settlement sat on land that had mineral deposits, copper, and possibly silver. Greer had been buying up surrounding territories, piece by piece. If he married Kashina, he'd gain legal claim to Cheyenne land through his wife. Then he could force the tribe to relocate and mine the valley himself. The scope of the scheme was breathtaking in its ambition. I asked why Greer didn't just kill Halion and take the land by force. The war chief smiled grimly. He said, because I have 50 warriors who would burn his trading posts to the ground and kill every man who works for him. Greer wants the land, but he wants to live to profit from it. Marriage gives him a legal path that doesn't end in warfare. Austin sat back down, his movements deliberate. Right then, one of Halion's scouts came riding hard into the ridge. He reported that 3 white men had been seen approaching the settlement from the south. The scout recognized one of them, Marcus Greer himself. He was coming to check on his investment, to see if Halion had found another fool to marry the cursed daughter. The timing couldn't have been coincidence. Austin had suspected even then that Greer had informants who'd reported his arrival. Halion made a decision. He told me to stay hidden on the ridge while he went down to meet Greer. He wanted me to observe, to see what kind of man we were dealing with, before making my final choice. So I stayed, concealed behind rocks, watching through an old cavalry spyglass that Halion lent me. Austin described the scene that had unfolded below. How Greer had ridden into the settlement with 2 hired guns flanking him, both men wearing tied-down pistols and carrying themselves with the casual arrogance of professional killers. How the Cheyenne people had watched in silence, faces carefully neutral. As Halion emerged from his lodge to greet the visitors, Marcus Greer was 51 years old then, but well-preserved. Tall, over 6 feet, with silver hair and expensive clothes that looked ridiculous in a Cheyenne settlement. He had the kind of face that seemed trustworthy at first glance, open, smiling, friendly. But I'd learned during the war to look at how a man held himself, not just what he showed on the surface. Greer held himself like someone who expected obedience. Through the spyglass, Austin had watched the entire conversation, unable to hear words but reading volumes in body language. Greer and Halion spoke for maybe 2 minutes. Greer was smiling, gesturing expansively, playing the role of friendly trader. Halion's responses were brief, minimal. Then Greer said something that made Halion's jaw tighten. One of Greer's gunmen laughed. That's when Kashina emerged from her separate lodge. Austin's voice softened despite himself. She'd replaced her veil, covering her face again. But even from a distance, even through the spyglass, I could see the proud way she carried herself. She walked straight up to Greer and stood facing him, silent and defiant. Greer reached out as if to touch her face, to lift the veil. Kashina stepped back. Greer's smile never wavered, but I saw his hand clench into a fist for just a moment before relaxing. The interaction had lasted less than a minute, but it had told Austin everything he needed to know. Greer spoke to Kashina. She shook her head. He spoke again, voice rising enough that I could hear anger in the tone even if I couldn't make out words. Hillian stepped between them. Greer's two gunmen moved their hands toward their weapons. Halian's warriors, who'd been standing at a careful distance, moved closer. The tension was thick enough to cut. Then something unexpected had happened. A child, maybe 5 years old, came running through the settlement chasing a dog. The child wasn't watching where he was going and ran straight into one of Greer's gunmen, bounced off the man's leg and fell hard. The child started crying. Kashina immediately knelt down to help him up, check him for injuries. Austin paused, the memory still sharp. The child's mother came running, terrified. Not of her child being hurt, but of him being near Kashina. She snatched the boy away from Kashina's hands like she was rescuing him from a poisonous snake, held him close, and backed away quickly. The look on Kashina's face in that moment, even veiled, even from a distance, was heartbreaking. Pure isolation. Greer had noticed too. Through the spyglass, Austin had seen him smile at Kashina's pain. That's when I made my decision. Not because I needed the land, though I did. Not because Halian had backed me into a corner, though he had. I decided because I just watched a man smile at a woman suffering. And something in me couldn't let that stand. Owen was watching Austin's face carefully. Seeing the emotion the older man rarely displayed, I rode down from the ridge. Didn't announce myself, didn't make a dramatic entrance. Just rode calmly into the settlement and dismounted near where Greer stood with Halian. Every eye turned to me. Greer's smile faltered for just a second, then returned broader than before. The confrontation had been inevitable from that moment. Greer spoke first. He said, "And who might you be, friend?" I told him my name was Austin Masters, and I wasn't his friend. His smile tightened. He asked what brought me to Halian's settlement. I said I was there to discuss a marriage proposal. Austin's voice took on the flat, dangerous quality it had carried that day. The silence that followed was absolute. Every Cheyenne in the settlement went completely still. Greer's gunmen tensed. Halian's face remained neutral, but I caught the slightest nod of approval. Greer's smile finally disappeared completely. He asked who I was planning to marry. I looked directly at Kashina and said, "The war chief's daughter, if she have me." Kashina had been completely still, her veiled face turned toward Austin. Greer recovered quickly. He laughed, said I clearly didn't understand the situation. He explained about the curse, about the 3 dead warriors, about how foolish it would be for an outsider to involve himself in Cheyenne affairs. I told him I didn't believe in curses. He said belief wasn't required for death to find me. The threat had been delivered with a smile, but it was unmistakable. I asked Greer what his interest was in the matter. He said he was a friend to the Cheyenne people, concerned for their welfare and traditions. I said he seemed more concerned with controlling who they could marry. His face went cold then, all pretense of friendliness evaporating. He told me I was making a serious mistake. Austin had felt the weight of those words, understood the promise of violence beneath them. I responded by asking Halian in front of everyone whether his offer to me still stood. The war chief said yes, if I was certain. I said I was certain. Then I turned to Kashina and asked her directly, in front of the entire settlement, if she would marry me. Give her the choice publicly, where no one could claim I'd coerced her. The moment had stretched out, time seeming to slow. Kashina was silent for maybe 5 seconds. Then she spoke, her voice clear and strong despite the veil. She said, "Yes, I will marry you, Austin Masters. Not because my father demands it, not because tradition requires it, but because you are the first man who has treated me like a person instead of a problem." I accept your proposal. Greer's face had gone from cold to murderous in an instant. He told me I had 3 days to reconsider before the wedding ceremony. 3 days to ride away and forget this foolishness. After that, he said, my blood would be on my own hands. I asked him if that was a threat. He smiled again, that empty merchant smile, and said it was a prophecy. Curses had a way of fulfilling themselves. Then Greer had ridden away with his gunmen, leaving a wake of tension behind. As soon as he was gone, Hellion pulled me aside. He said I'd just painted a target on myself bigger than anything I'd faced in the war. Greer would act fast, probably send men that very night. We needed to prepare, needed to be ready for whatever was coming. Austin stood and walked to check on their horses. Old habits from dangerous times. Hellion proposed something unexpected. He said the wedding ceremony would happen immediately that night, under Cheyenne law. White law didn't recognize Cheyenne marriages officially, but it created enough legal ambiguity that Greer couldn't simply kill me and claim Kashina was still unmarried. If I died after the ceremony, Kashina would be a widow with potential claim to any property I might acquire. The legal maneuvering was complex, but it created protection through confusion, I agreed. Hellion sent riders to bring you back from where you'd been staying with the Cheyenne family. I wanted you close, where I could protect you if things went wrong. You arrived an hour before sunset, confused but trusting. Austin remembered Owen's face that evening, trying so hard to understand what was happening. I knelt down and explained as simply as I could. I told you I was going to marry Hellion's daughter, that it would give us land and a future, but it might also put us in danger. I asked if you trusted me to make the right decision. You said yes without hesitation. That trust meant more than you could know. The wedding ceremony had been unlike anything Austin had experienced. Cheyenne weddings aren't like white ceremonies. There's no church, no formal vows in the Christian sense. The families exchange gifts, the couple makes public declaration, and the community witnesses. Hellion had organized everything in less than 3 hours. Austin described how the entire settlement had gathered as the sun set, creating a circle of people around a central fire. How Hellion had stood with Kashina on one side, Austin on the other, with Owen beside him. Hellion spoke first in Cheyenne, then repeated it in English for my benefit. He said his daughter was choosing her own path, selecting a husband not from obligation but from free will. Anyone who disputed this could speak now or forever hold their peace. Silence followed. Not because everyone approved, but because Hellion's authority was absolute. Then had come the moment Austin had been both anticipating and dreading. Hellion told Kashina she could remove her veil for the ceremony, that as a married woman she would no longer need to hide her face. She reached up slowly, her hands trembling slightly. When she pulled the veil away and faced the assembled tribe unveiled for the first time in 6 years, the reaction was mixed. Some people had gasped. Others had looked away. A few had actually stepped backward, but she was beautiful. Owen, standing there in the firelight, chin lifted in defiance of their fear. She was the bravest thing I'd ever seen. She looked at her people with an expression that dared them to call her cursed into her unveiled face. No one did. Austin's voice carried respect that transcended the years. I was supposed to offer gifts to Hellion as bride price. I had nothing valuable except my rifle, my horse, and my cavalry saber from the war. I offered all 3. Hellion refused them, said I'd need the weapons for what was coming. Instead, he gave me gifts: a Cheyenne knife, a blanket woven by Kashina herself, and a small pouch of earth from the valley, symbolizing the land I was being welcomed into. The ceremony had been brief but powerful. Kashina and I stood facing each other. She spoke first, in Cheyenne, words I didn't understand but felt the weight of. Then in English she said, I accept you as my husband, Austin Masters. I offer you my trust, my partnership, and my loyalty. I ask the same in return. Simple, direct, honest. Austin had responded in kind, I said. "I accept you as my wife, Kashina. I offer you my protection, my respect, and my commitment. I promise to see you as you are, not as others fear you to be." Then Hellion placed both our hands together, bound them with a leather cord for 10 seconds while the tribe witnessed, then released them. That had been the entirety of the ceremony. We were married. By Cheyenne law, by public declaration, by mutual choice. It had taken less than 20 minutes. But it had changed everything. The celebration that followed had been subdued. People still uncertain about the curse. About this white stranger, about what it all meant. That's when the attack came. 3 hours after sunset, while the settlement was settling down for the night. Gunfire from the darkness, bullets cutting through lodge walls. Greer hadn't waited even one full day. He'd sent his men to kill me before the marriage could be consummated. Before any legal complications could arise. Austin's voice went flat with remembered violence. There were 8 of them. Professional killers, hired guns from Denver and Cheyenne City. They came in shooting, trying to create chaos and locate me in the confusion. But they'd made one critical mistake. They'd attacked a Cheyenne settlement defended by warriors who'd fought the U.S. cavalry to a standstill more than once. The battle had been brief and brutal. Hellion's warriors responded instantly. Arrows flew from the darkness, silent and deadly. I grabbed my Winchester and took position near Kashina's lodge, protecting her and you both. I saw one of the attackers trying to circle around. I dropped him with a single shot at 40 yards. The sound of my rifle was distinct from the others, and suddenly I became a specific target. Austin touched the scar on his neck that Owen had asked about the night before. That's when I got this. A bullet grazed my neck, so close I felt the heat of it passing. Half an inch to the left and I'd be dead. I went down hard, blood everywhere, and for a moment I thought the curse had actually come for me. But Kashina was there instantly, dragging me behind cover, her hands pressing against the wound to stop the bleeding. The irony hadn't been lost on him even then. The cursed woman saved my life that night. While the battle raged around us, while men died and bullets flew, Kashina kept me alive through sheer determination and skill. She'd learned healing from her mother, knew how to treat wounds. She worked on my neck with steady hands while I tried to keep my rifle up and ready. The attack had ended within 15 minutes. Hellion's warriors killed 5 of the 8 attackers. 2 more were captured wounded. The last one escaped into the darkness, bleeding from an arrow wound. We found him the next morning, dead from blood loss half a mile from the settlement. Austin paused, letting the weight of that violence settle. We interrogated the 2 survivors. They confirmed what we already knew. Greer had hired them, paid them $200 each to kill me specifically. They'd been told to make it look like a crow raid, leave crow arrows in the bodies. Same playbook he'd used on Standing Bear, but this time there were witnesses, survivors who could testify. I told Hellion we needed to take this to the territorial marshal in Fort Laramie. We had evidence now, living witnesses who could implicate Greer in murder for hire. It wasn't perfect evidence, but it might be enough to at least force an investigation. The war chief had agreed. And that's where the second night's story would end. Tomorrow night, Austin said to Owen, I'll tell you about the journey to Fort Laramie, about what we found there, and about how Kashina proved she was far more than anyone had ever given her credit for. For now you need to sleep. We're almost to the ranch, almost home. Owen nodded slowly and crawled into his bedroll. Austin stayed by the fire, one hand unconsciously touching the scar on his neck, remembering the woman who'd saved him, the battle that had forged their marriage in blood, and the long road that had followed. The third night found them camped within sight of the ranch, close enough that Owen could see the lamplight burning in the windows where Kashina waited with their daughter. The valley spread before them in the moonlight, peaceful and prosperous, showing no trace of the violence that had birthed it. Austin built the fire higher than usual, Knowing this part of the story required full darkness to tell properly, Owen didn't need prompting this time. As soon as they'd finished their meal of cornbread and dried venison, he looked at Austin expectantly. What happened on the way to Fort Laramie? Austin poured coffee for them both, the ritual familiar and comforting. The journey started before dawn the morning after the attack. Hillian selected 4 of his best warriors to escort us. 2 scouts who knew every trail between the settlement and the fort, and 2 fighters in case we encountered more of Greer's hired guns. Kashina insisted on coming despite my objections. He sipped his coffee, remembering that argument. I told her it was too dangerous, that she should stay protected in the settlement. She looked at me with those dark eyes and said something I'd never forget. I've been hiding behind veils and lodge walls for 6 years while men decided my fate. No more. This is my life, my fight, and I'll see it through to the end. There was steel in her voice that made arguing pointless. Owen smiled slightly at that. He'd heard that same tone from Kashina many times over the years. So we rode out at first light, me, Kashina, the 4 Cheyenne warriors, and the 2 wounded prisoners tied to their horses. You stayed with Hillian, which I hated, but it was safer than bringing you along. The fort was 90 miles southeast, 3 days hard riding through country that got more dangerous with every mile. Austin described the landscape they'd crossed, rolling grasslands giving way to badlands, twisted rock formations that looked like the bones of ancient giants, creek beds that ran dry for months at a time. They'd moved fast, changing horses twice at Cheyenne camps along the way, stopping only when necessary. On the second day, we spotted riders following us. 5 men, keeping their distance but matching our pace exactly. Kashina noticed them first, her eyes sharper than mine. One of the Cheyenne scouts confirmed they weren't tribal, weren't military. That left only one option, more of Greer's men. The cat-and-mouse chase had lasted for hours. We couldn't outrun them while dragging prisoners, and we couldn't afford a fight that might kill our witnesses. So we tried something else. There was an old trading post about 15 miles ahead, run by a French-Canadian named Baptiste who'd lived in the territory for 30 years. He was neutral, refused to take sides in white Indian conflicts, just wanted to trade in peace. Austin's plan had been to seek temporary refuge there. We reached Baptiste's post just before sunset. It was built like a small fort, thick log walls, rifle slots cut at strategic points, a heavy gate that could be barred from inside. Baptiste was 65 years old then, white-bearded, massive in the shoulders from decades of hard work. He recognized the Cheyenne warriors and welcomed us cautiously. The old trader had listened to their situation with sharp intelligence in his pale blue eyes. I explained that we had prisoners needed for testimony against Marcus Greer, that hired guns were following us, that we needed safe shelter for the night. Baptiste spit tobacco juice into the dirt and said, "Greer, he is a bastard who owes me $300 from 4 years past. Any enemy of his finds welcome here." Just like that, we had an ally. Baptiste had proven more valuable than Austin could have anticipated. He told us something we didn't know. Marcus Greer's trading empire was collapsing. Several of his supply contracts had fallen through. His creditors in Denver were demanding payment, and rumors were circulating that he was involved in illegal land schemes. Greer was desperate, which made him more dangerous. A desperate man takes risks a comfortable man wouldn't consider. The 5 riders had arrived an hour after sunset, camping visible from the trading post but not approaching. Baptiste went out to talk to them, bold as you please. He took whiskey as a peace offering, sat at their fire, and came back an hour later with intelligence. The leader was a man called Dulin, a Missouri border ruffian with a reputation for violence. Greer had hired him specifically to ensure I never reached Fort Laramie. They were waiting for reinforcements before attacking the post. Austin had realized then that they'd walked into a trap. More men were coming from the south, cutting off our route to the fort. Greer had probably sent multiple groups in different directions, covering all possible paths. We were cornered, Baptist offered to let us wait it out, said his walls were strong and he had enough supplies for a siege. But waiting meant our prisoners might die from their wounds, or Greer might find some way to discredit them. That's when Kashina had proposed an alternative. She said we didn't need to go to Fort Laramie. There was a federal circuit judge who traveled through the territory, hearing cases at various settlements. His name was Harlan Thorne, and according to Baptist's information, he was currently in a town called Redemption, only 40 miles northwest. If we could reach Judge Thorne, we could present our evidence without the dangerous journey to the fort. The plan had merit, but the execution would be treacherous. The trail to Redemption went through different territory than the Fort Laramie road. DeLand's men were positioned to block the southeast route, not the northwest. If we could slip away before dawn, we might evade them entirely. But it meant traveling through rough country. Canyons and narrow passes where ambush would be easy if they figured out our destination. Austin had consulted with the Cheyenne scouts. They knew the northwest trails. Said there was an old Cheyenne path that wound through the Badlands. Difficult to follow but impossible to track if you knew how to hide your trail. We'd have to abandon the horses partway through and continue on foot through areas where mounted pursuit couldn't follow. It was risky, but staying put was riskier. They'd left at 3 in the morning, hours before dawn. Baptist created a diversion. He kept fires burning in the post, made it look like we were still there. He even had his wife move around inside, creating shadows on the curtains. Meanwhile, we slipped out a back gate that faced away from where DeLand's men were camped. Moving silent as ghosts, the escape had been harrowing. We led the horses by hand for the first 5 miles, walking on rocky ground that wouldn't hold hoofprints. Kashina moved as quietly as the Cheyenne warriors. Years of living isolated had taught her to be invisible when necessary. I was the loudest of the group, my boots making sounds that seemed thunderous in the pre-dawn silence. As the sun rose, they'd reached the beginning of the Badlands. We entered a maze of canyons carved by ancient water. Walls of striated red and yellow stone rising hundreds of feet on either side. The trail was barely visible, marked by cairns of stacked rocks that only the Cheyenne knew to look for. We had to leave the horses with one warrior who would circle back to Baptist's post, while the rest of us continued on foot. Austin described the brutal march that followed, hours of scrambling over loose scree, navigating narrow ledges where one misstep meant a fatal fall, hauling the prisoners through terrain they were in no condition to traverse. The wounded men had slowed them considerably, but they couldn't be abandoned. By midday, we heard pursuit. DeLand had figured out we'd escaped and was tracking us. But he was on horseback still, following the main canyon rather than the narrow side passages we were using. We could hear him shouting orders to his men, the sound echoing strangely off the canyon walls, making it impossible to judge distance accurately. They'd hidden in a cave-like overhang while the pursuers passed below. We were maybe 60 feet above them, pressed back into the shadows. I counted 8 riders now, more than the original 5. Greer must have sent reinforcements that merged with Doolin's group. One of our prisoners started to moan from pain, and one of the Cheyenne warriors clamped a hand over his mouth instantly. We stayed frozen like that for 10 full minutes, while Doolin's men searched the canyon floor below us. The tension of that moment still made Austin's pulse quicken. They didn't find us. Eventually they rode on, convinced we'd taken a different route. We waited another hour before moving, making sure they were truly gone. By then it was mid-afternoon, and we still had 20 miles to cover before reaching Redemption. The journey became a race against time and physical endurance. We emerged from the Badlands near a river ford, refilled our canteens, and pushed northwest toward Redemption. The prisoners were failing badly now, one of them barely conscious, the other delirious with fever from his infected wound. I told the Cheyenne warriors we might have to leave them, that getting the testimony was less important than keeping Kashina safe. She'd overheard and disagreed vehemently. Kashina said abandoning the prisoners meant Greer would win. That without witnesses we had nothing but accusations. She was right, but I was torn between justice and protecting her. That's when she reminded me of something. She'd survived 6 years of isolation, 3 murders attributed to a curse designed to destroy her, and an attack by professional killers. She didn't need me to coddle her. The rebuke had been gentle but firm. She said, "I chose to marry you, Austin. I chose this fight. Respect my choice enough to let me see it through." So we continued, dragging the failing prisoners with us, determined to reach the judge before they died. They'd arrived in Redemption just after dark.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
The town was small, maybe 300 people. But it had a proper courthouse because Judge Thorne used it as one of his regular circuit stops. We went straight there, found the judge in his rooms adjacent to the courtroom, and demanded an emergency hearing. Judge Harlan Thorne had been skeptical at first. He was 58 years old, silver-haired, wearing spectacles that made his eyes look larger than they were. He listened to our story with the patient expression of a man who'd heard countless wild tales from desperate people. But when we brought in the prisoners, when they confirmed that Marcus Greer had hired them to commit murder, something shifted in the judge's demeanor. Thorne had called for the town's doctor to treat the prisoners, then convened an immediate preliminary hearing. It was midnight by the time we gathered in the courtroom. Just me, Kashina, the Cheyenne warriors, Judge Thorne, his clerk, and the town sheriff as a witness. No formal procedures, no lawyers, just sworn testimony recorded in the judge's own hand. The prisoners had talked, motivated by pain and fear. They described how Greer had approached them in a Denver saloon, offered $200 each to kill a man named Austin Masters who was interfering with Greer's business interests. They'd been told to make it look like an Indian attack, to leave Cheyenne arrows if possible. They didn't know the full context, didn't care. They were hired killers following orders. More damaging was what they revealed about Greer's other crimes. Under questioning from Judge Thorne, they admitted that Greer had hired them for previous jobs too. One of them had been involved in the murder of Standing Bear 2 years prior, the Cheyenne warrior killed with crow arrows. He described exactly how they'd done it. Ambushed Standing Bear on a trail, killed him with purchased crow arrows, then left evidence pointing to tribal warfare. The testimony was devastating. Judge Thorne wrote everything down in meticulous detail. When he finished, he looked up and said, "This is sufficient for me to issue a warrant for Marcus Greer's arrest on charges of conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, and fraud. However, executing that warrant will be difficult. Greer has money, influence, and probably more hired guns. We'll need federal marshals, which means sending to Fort Laramie anyway." Austin had expected this complication. I asked how long it would take to get marshals. The judge said at least a week, maybe 2. In that time, Greer could disappear, could liquidate his assets and flee to California or Mexico. We needed to move faster. That's when Kashina spoke up for the first time during the proceedings. Her proposal had been bold. She said we didn't need to wait for marshals to find Greer. We knew where he'd be, at his main trading post in Copper Falls, the same town where I'd first met Halian's men. It was his headquarters, his base of operations. If Judge Thorne wrote the warrant, she and I would deliver it ourselves with the Cheyenne warriors as backup. The judge had been appalled. He said civilians couldn't serve arrest warrants, that it was illegal and dangerous. Kashina pointed out that territorial law was flexible on jurisdictional matters, especially regarding crimes against native peoples. If a federal judge issued a warrant, and representatives of the affected tribe executed it, there was legal precedent from earlier cases. Austin had been surprised by her knowledge. I asked Kashina later how she knew about legal precedents. She told me she'd spent her 6 years of isolation reading every law book and newspaper that made its way to the settlement. She'd educated herself in white man's law, specifically so she could understand the mechanisms being used against her people. Knowledge was the only weapon she'd had access to. Judge Thorne had reluctantly agreed. He wrote out a formal warrant for Marcus Greer's arrest, signed and sealed it with his official seal, and handed it to me. Then he said, "If Greer resists, if this becomes a violent confrontation, I cannot protect you legally. You understand that?" I understood. We were walking into a situation that could easily become a bloodbath. They'd left redemption before dawn the next morning. The prisoners were left in the doctor's care under guard. The Cheyenne warriors Kashina and I rode hard for Copper Falls, covering the 60 miles in a day and a half of brutal riding. We arrived in town on a Tuesday afternoon, dusty and exhausted, carrying a warrant that might mean nothing if Greer decided to fight rather than submit to arrest. Copper Falls had changed since Austin's first visit. Where before it had seemed prosperous and bustling, now it looked shabby and declining. Several businesses were closed, boards nailed over windows. The streets were quieter than they should have been. Baptist had been right. Greer's empire was crumbling, and the town that depended on his trade was suffering. They'd gone first to the sheriff's office. The sheriff was a man named Doyle, 45 years old, balding, with the look of someone who'd been worn down by compromises. When I showed him Judge Thorne's warrant, his face went pale. He said, "You're asking me to arrest the most powerful man in this territory based on testimony from hired guns and Indians?" The contempt in his voice when he said Indians made the Cheyenne warriors tense. Austin had kept his own anger controlled. I told Doyle he didn't have to arrest Greer. I would do it myself, with the warriors as witnesses. Doyle could simply observe and verify that proper legal procedure was followed. The sheriff looked relieved to avoid direct involvement, which told me everything about his character. He agreed to accompany us to Greer's trading post, but made it clear he wouldn't intervene unless absolutely necessary. The confrontation had been inevitable. Greer's trading post was the largest building in Copper Falls, 2 stories, wraparound porch, iron bars on the lower windows. It looked more like a fortress than a business, which should have been a warning. We approached openly, making no attempt at stealth. I wanted this done legally and publicly. Marcus Greer had been waiting on the porch. He stood there as we approached, flanked by 4 armed men. His silver hair was perfectly groomed, his clothes immaculate despite the dust everywhere else. He smiled that empty merchant smile and called out, "Mr. Masters, I heard you survived your wedding night. The curse must not be as powerful as advertised." His men laughed on cue. Austin had dismounted calmly. I walked forward with the warrant visible in my hand. I announced in a voice loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear that I was executing a federal arrest warrant for Marcus Greer on charges of conspiracy to commit murder. Greer's smile never wavered, but his eyes went cold and calculating. The merchant had tried negotiation first. He said there must be some misunderstanding, that he was a respected businessman, that accusations from criminals and savages couldn't possibly be taken seriously by a federal judge. I told him Judge Thorne had found the testimony credible enough to issue a warrant. Greer's smile finally cracked. He said, "You're making a terrible mistake, Masters. You have no idea the forces you're playing with." Then Kashina had stepped forward. She'd been standing slightly behind me, still partially concealed. When she moved into full view, removing the travel cloak that had hidden her face, the reaction was immediate. Greer's expression shifted from confident to shocked to murderous in the span of 3 seconds. He hadn't expected her to be there. Kashina spoke with absolute clarity. She said, "Marcus Greer, you murdered Swift Horse, Running Wolf, and Standing Bear. You created a false curse to isolate me, to make me desperate enough to accept your control. You hired assassins to kill my husband. All of this to steal Cheyenne land you have no right to claim. Your schemes have failed. You will face justice now. The public accusation, delivered in front of the entire town, made denial impossible. Greer's face went red with rage. He shouted that she was a cursed woman, that everyone who touched her died, that I would be dead within the year, just like the others. Kashina responded calmly, "The only curse is you. And it ends today." Then she turned to the crowd and asked if anyone there had actually seen evidence of a supernatural curse, or if they'd only heard rumors spread by this man. The silence from the crowd was telling. No one spoke up to support Greer's curse narrative. The lie was falling apart in real time. Greer realized he was losing control of the situation. That's when he made his move. He signaled his men, hands dropping toward weapons. I'd been expecting this, had my hand on my pistol already. The violence erupted in seconds. Greer's men drew first, but the Cheyenne warriors were faster. Arrows flew before guns could clear leather. 2 of Greer's guards went down immediately, arrows to the shoulder and thigh, disabling shots that showed remarkable precision. The other 2 managed to draw, but I dropped one with a shot to his gun hand before he could fire. The 4th man froze, looking at the blood and the armed Cheyenne warriors, and wisely surrendered. Greer himself had tried to run. He bolted into his trading post, slamming and barring the door behind him. I could hear him shouting inside, presumably to more men. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Sheriff Doyle was yelling something about illegal discharge of weapons, utterly useless. The crowd had scattered for cover. That's when Kashina did something unexpected. She walked straight up to the barred door and called out to Greer. She said, "You can hide in there until more of your men arrive, maybe kill us in the fight that follows. But Judge Thorne knows everything. Federal marshals are already being summoned. Even if you kill us, you'll hang eventually. Or you can surrender now, face trial, and perhaps save your life." Her voice was steady, reasonable, offering him a path that wasn't total destruction. The offer had hung in the air for maybe 20 seconds. Then we heard the bar being lifted. The door opened slowly. Marcus Greer stood there, no longer smiling, looking older and smaller than before. He said, "I want a lawyer. I want formal charges in writing. I want every legal protection the law allows." Kashina nodded and said, "You'll have them. That's the difference between us and you. We believe in actual justice, not just revenge." Sheriff Doyle had finally found his courage. He stepped forward and placed Greer under arrest officially, reading the charges from Judge Thorne's warrant. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the most powerful man in Copper Falls was led away in chains. Several people in the crowd started talking, questioning, realizing they'd been manipulated by Greer's lies for years. The aftermath had moved quickly. Within 2 days, federal marshals arrived from Fort Laramie. They took custody of Greer and the wounded prisoners. Judge Thorne traveled to Copper Falls personally to oversee the preliminary proceedings. The evidence was overwhelming. Testimony from multiple witnesses, Greer's own suspicious reactions, and financial records found in his trading post that documented bribes and illegal land schemes. Austin paused, remembering the weight of victory. Marcus Greer was transported to the territorial capital for trial. 6 months later, he was convicted of 3 counts of murder, 2 counts of attempted murder, fraud, and corruption. He was sentenced to hang. The execution was carried out on a cold January morning in 1880. I wasn't there to witness it, but Halion was. He said Greer showed no remorse, blamed everyone but himself until the very end. The fire was burning low. Austin fed it one more time. That should have been the end of the story. Owen, justice served, the curse revealed as a lie. Kashina and I free to build our life. But there was one more twist, one more revelation that changed everything. Tomorrow night, I'll tell you about what we discovered in Greer's papers. about the true scope of his schemes, and about how Kashina's strength through those final trials proved she was never cursed. She was blessed with a courage most people will never possess. Owen started to protest, wanting the rest immediately. But Austin shook his head. Some stories need to breathe between tellings. Sleep now. Tomorrow we'll be home, and you'll see Kashina again, understand why this story matters. The past shaped us, but it doesn't define us. That's the lesson you need to learn. The boy nodded reluctantly and settled into his bedroll. Austin sat watching the fire, remembering the months that had followed Greer's arrest. The discoveries that had rewritten everything they thought they knew. And the woman who had faced it all with unwavering strength. The fourth night arrived with unexpected weight. They were camped less than a mile from the ranch house now, close enough that Austin could have called out and been heard. But he'd chosen this spot deliberately, a small rise overlooking the valley where everything had happened, where the past and present existed in the same breath of Wyoming wind. The fire cast shadows that seemed to dance with memory. Owen had been unusually quiet all day, processing the story so far, trying to understand how violence and justice could intertwine so completely. As darkness settled, he finally spoke. "You said there was one more twist. What did you find in Greer's papers?" Austin stared into the flames for a long moment before answering. "We found the truth. The whole ugly truth that Marcus Greer had spent years hiding. The real reason he'd wanted Kashina so desperately." He paused, choosing his words with the care of a man defusing a bomb. After Greer's arrest, the federal marshal seized all his business records. Ledgers, contracts, correspondence, everything. Judge Thorne asked me and Kashina to review the documents since we were the primary victims and might recognize details the marshals would miss. We spent 3 days in Copper Falls going through boxes of papers, and what we discovered was far worse than simple greed. The coffee pot sat near the fire. Austin poured 2 cups, the ritual giving him time to organize the revelation. Marcus Greer hadn't just wanted Cheyenne land for mining rights. That was part of it, certainly, but there was a deeper scheme. He'd been working with a consortium of investors from Denver and San Francisco, men who wanted to build a railroad spur through the northern valley. The proposed route would cut straight through Halian settlement, displacing the entire Cheyenne community. Owen's eyes widened. Austin continued. The railroad investors had approached Greer in 1874, 5 years before I arrived. They needed someone local to acquire the land rights quietly, without alerting the Cheyenne to what was being planned. Greer saw an opportunity for massive profit. If he could marry Kashina, gain legal claim to the valley through her, he could sell those rights to the railroad for a fortune. We found estimates in his papers ranging from $50,000 to $100,000. The scale of the conspiracy was staggering. But there was a complication: territorial law regarding native land rights. Even if Greer married Kashina, the Cheyenne tribe as a whole had communal claims to the valley that predated any individual ownership. The railroad investors needed those claims eliminated, which meant the tribe had to be relocated to a reservation. Austin's voice hardened with anger that still hadn't fully faded after 2 years. We found correspondence between Greer and a Bureau of Indian Affairs agent in Cheyenne City. The agent, a corrupt bureaucrat named Stillwell, had agreed to fabricate reports claiming the Cheyenne settlement was violating treaty terms, creating justification for forced relocation. In exchange, Greer would pay Stillwell $10,000 once the railroad deal closed. The depth of the betrayal cut deep. Greer's entire campaign against Kashina, the manufactured curse, the murdered warriors, all of it was designed to accomplish one goal: marry her, gain legal standing to negotiate for the valley, then use that standing to cooperate with federal authorities in removing the Cheyenne entirely. Kashina would be trapped in a marriage to a man who'd engineered her people's destruction. Owen's face showed the horror Austin had felt reading those documents. When Kashina read the letters between Greer and Stillwell, when she understood the full scope of what had been planned, she didn't cry or rage. She went very still, very quiet. Then she said something I'll never forget. My people were going to be erased from their home, and I was going to be the tool used to do it. Every moment I spent isolated and afraid. Greer was planning genocide disguised as legal process. The word genocide wasn't one Austin used lightly. Forced relocation to reservations killed more native people than bullets ever did. Starvation, disease, despair. Greer knew this. The investors knew this. They simply didn't care because native lives were worth less than railroad profits in their calculation. And they'd almost succeeded. Austin stood and paced, unable to sit still through this part. Judge Thorne was horrified when we showed him the evidence. He immediately sent copies to the territorial governor and the Federal Indian Affairs Office in Washington. Within a month, Agent Stillwell was arrested and charged with corruption. The Denver investors were investigated, though most escaped prosecution by claiming they'd been deceived by Greer about the legal situation. The injustice of wealthy men avoiding consequences while their hired conspirator hanged still rankled. But there was a silver lining. The publicity around the case, the exposure of the railroad scheme, created political pressure to formally recognize Cheyenne land rights in the Northern Valley. The territorial governor, facing scrutiny over how his office had allowed such corruption to flourish, personally negotiated a treaty with Julian. This was the part of the story that held hope. The treaty, signed in March of 1880, granted the Cheyenne settlement permanent ownership of 5,000 acres in the Northern Valley, not as a reservation with federal oversight, but as a land grant recognized under territorial law. Julian's people became legal landowners with the same property rights as any white settler. It was unprecedented. Kashina had been instrumental in negotiating the specific terms. She'd spent those 6 years of isolation reading law, understanding the mechanisms of white legal systems. Now she used that knowledge to protect her people. She insisted on clauses preventing the land from being sold or transferred without tribal council approval. She demanded water rights be explicitly included, knowing that Western law often separated surface land from water access. She thought of details the white negotiators tried to gloss over. The territorial governor had been impressed despite himself. He told Halion afterward that Kashina would have made a formidable lawyer if she'd been born white and male. Halion's response was perfect. She makes a formidable Cheyenne woman. Which is worth more? The governor had no answer to that. Austin sat back down, the memory bringing a slight smile. But securing the treaty was only half the battle. The land grant came with a requirement. Within 5 years, the Cheyenne settlement had to demonstrate productive use of the acreage, which in white legal terms meant farming, ranching, or mining. Traditional Cheyenne lifestyle, living in balance with the land without permanent agriculture, didn't count as productive in territorial law. This requirement had created a dilemma. Halion called a tribal council to discuss how to meet this requirement without abandoning Cheyenne ways entirely. Some argued for starting large-scale farming, others for opening copper mines. The debate was heated, with younger members wanting to modernize and elders resisting changes that would alter their culture fundamentally. Kashina had proposed a compromise. She suggested a hybrid approach, establish a cattle ranch that could be managed using some traditional practices combined with modern techniques. Cheyenne had been horse people for generations. Transitioning to cattle wouldn't be such a vast cultural leap. The ranch would be communally owned, profits shared. Decisions made by council vote rather than by a single boss. The idea had merit, but required expertise the settlement lacked. That's where I came in. I'd worked cattle drives before the war, knew the basics of ranching. Halion asked if I'd be willing to help establish and manage the operation. The land grant he'd originally promised me, 200 acres, would be adjacent to the communal ranch, making me both a neighbor and a partner, Austin had agreed immediately, seeing it as a way to build something meaningful. Over the next 6 months, we built the ranch from nothing. Helene contributed horses to trade for initial cattle stock. I used what little money I'd saved to buy supplies. The entire settlement pitched in on construction, raising barns and fences and corrals. It was backbreaking work, dawn to dusk every day. But we were building a future during this time. Austin and Kashina's marriage evolved from legal arrangement to genuine partnership. We'd been married under Cheyenne law, but Kashina wanted to formalize it under territorial law as well. She said it would strengthen her legal standing when negotiating with white authorities, make it harder for anyone to claim our marriage was invalid. So we went to Copper Falls and had a territorial judge perform a civil ceremony. The second wedding had been deliberately modest. Just the two of us, the judge, and 2 witnesses pulled from the street. No celebration, no announcements. We signed the paperwork, paid the $5 fee, and rode back to the settlement the same day. But it mattered. Kashina kept the marriage certificate in a locked box, along with the land grant treaty and other crucial documents. She understood that in white society, paper proof was everything. Meanwhile, Owen had been growing up in this environment. You were 12 then, old enough to start learning real work. I put you in charge of the horses initially, feeding and grooming and basic training. You took to it naturally, showed a patience with animals that can't be taught. Kashina started teaching you Cheyenne language and customs. Said if you were going to live in this community, you should understand and respect it. The boy had thrived in ways Austin hadn't anticipated. You became a bridge between cultures without even realizing it. The Cheyenne children accepted you because Kashina vouched for you, and you treated them as equals. The few white families who lived nearby saw you as one of their own. You moved between both worlds effortlessly, which is a rare gift. By the winter of 1880, the ranch was operational. We had 200 head of cattle, enough to prove productive use of the land. The first year was brutal, learning through costly mistakes, losing animals to harsh weather and predators, and simple inexperience. But we survived. The second year was better. By the third year, we were actually profitable, selling beef to Fort Laramie and surrounding settlements. Then came the revelation that changed everything again. In the spring of 1881, Kashina told me she was pregnant. We'd been married nearly 2 years by then. Our partnership had deepened into something neither of us had expected or planned for. Something that looked remarkably like love, though we'd never explicitly named it. Austin's voice softened with the memory. I asked her how she felt about it. She was quiet for a long moment, then said she was terrified. The curse might be proven false. The shaman's prophecy might be lies. But fear doesn't dissolve instantly just because logic says it should. Part of her still worried that bringing a child into the world would somehow trigger the death that had been predicted. The psychological weight of years of isolation couldn't be erased overnight. I told her something then that I'd been thinking for months, but hadn't known how to express. I said that the curse had never been about supernatural forces or shamanic prophecies. The curse was fear itself, the way Greer had weaponized her community's beliefs against her. The only way to truly break a curse like that was to live fully despite it. To refuse to let fear dictate choices. Kashina had cried then. Really cried for the first time in Austin's presence. Not sad tears, but relieved ones. She said she'd been waiting for me to show fear, to prove that some part of me believed the curse despite my rational denials. The fact that I could hear about the pregnancy and respond with joy instead of dread finally convinced her that maybe, just maybe, she could believe in a future without death shadowing it. The pregnancy had been difficult. Kashina was sick for the first 3 months, could barely keep food down. The settlement's medicine woman, an elder named Adzila, tended to her with traditional remedies that helped some. I was useless, hovering anxiously, driving Kashina to frustration with my constant concern. She finally told me to go work the ranch and trust that women had been having babies since the beginning of time, without nervous husbands interfering. Owen laughed at that, clearly having heard similar sentiments from Kashina. Our daughter was born in December 1881, during a snowstorm that blanketed the valley in 2 feet of powder. The birth was long and difficult, lasting nearly a full day. I wore a path in the snow outside the lodge, pacing like a caged animal while Adsila and 2 other women attended Kashina inside. The moment when he'd first heard his daughter cry remained crystalline in Austin's memory. That sound, the thin wail of new life, hit me harder than any bullet I'd taken in the war. I burst into the lodge despite tradition, saying men should wait outside. Kashina was exhausted, drenched in sweat, but smiling wider than I'd ever seen. She held this tiny, wrinkled, perfect human and said, "We broke the curse. She's alive, I'm alive, you're alive." We won. They'd named the baby Aida, meaning first to dance. Kashina chose the name. Said our daughter represented a new beginning, a first step into a future free from manufactured fear. Helion held his granddaughter with tears running down his weathered face. Said she was proof that love and determination could overcome even the darkest schemes. But the celebration was interrupted by unexpected visitors. 3 days after Aida's birth, a delegation arrived from the territorial capital. 5 men in expensive suits, representatives of the railroad investors, who'd been working with Greer. They requested a meeting with Helion and the tribal council. Said they had a business proposition. Austin had immediately been suspicious. I attended the meeting as Kashina's husband and representative, since she was still recovering from childbirth. The investors' spokesman, a silver-haired man named Caldwell, presented their offer with the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. The proposition was audacious. Caldwell said they still wanted to build the railroad spur through the valley. They acknowledged that their previous methods, working through Greer, had been regrettable. But the economic benefits of the railroad were undeniable. Access to markets, increased land values, connection to the wider territory. They were offering to purchase a right-of-way through Cheyenne land for $20,000. $20,000 was a fortune in 1881. It was more money than the entire settlement had seen in a decade. Caldwell painted a picture of prosperity, modernization, opportunity. He made it sound reasonable, beneficial, like refusing would be economic suicide. Several of the younger tribal council members were clearly tempted. Helion had listened in stony silence. When Caldwell finished his pitch, the war chief spoke. He said, "You offer us money to destroy our home. You dress it in prettier words than Greer used, but the meaning is the same. Our answer is the same as it was 2 years ago. No." Caldwell's smile tightened. He said the railroad was coming to the territory regardless. That routing it around Cheyenne land would be more expensive, but not impossible. Cooperation would be profitable, resistance would be pointless. The threat was implicit but clear. I spoke up then, asked Caldwell if he was threatening federal landowners. Because that's what the Cheyenne were now, legal owners with territorial protection. Any attempt to coerce them would be a federal crime. Caldwell backpedaled immediately, said I'd misunderstood. No threats were intended. But the message had been delivered. After the investors left, the tribal council debated. Some argued that $20,000 could fund schools, medical facilities, improvements to the entire settlement. Others countered that money meant nothing if it came at the cost of their home. The debate lasted 3 hours, voices rising in passion on both sides. Kashina had been carried to the council lodge on a litter. Still too weak to walk but determined to participate, she listened to both sides, then spoke with the clarity that had become her trademark. She said, "Money is temporary. Land is permanent. Our children and grandchildren will need this valley long after $20,000 is spent. If we sell the right-of-way, we give these men power over our future. They'll be back in 5 years asking for more and more, until nothing remains. The answer must be no, not because we're stubborn, but because some things cannot be priced. Her argument carried the day. The council voted to refuse the railroad offer. Caldwell and his investors were informed the next day. They left angry, making vague noises about legal challenges and alternative routes. True to their word, the railroad was eventually built. But it went 30 miles south of the valley, through less optimal but available terrain. The Cheyenne settlement's refusal had actually increased their respect in the territory. Other native communities facing similar pressure took notice. Here was a tribe that had said no to powerful interests and made it stick. Delegations started visiting, asking how Halion had secured legal land rights, how they'd organized their defense against white encroachment. The settlement became a model, however imperfect, of successful resistance to displacement. Austin paused, adding wood to the fire. Over the following year, life settled into something resembling normalcy. The ranch prospered. Aida grew from newborn to toddler, healthy and strong and absolutely fearless. You helped raise her, Owen, becoming the protective older brother before we ever formally discussed family dynamics. The community had evolved as well. More white families moved to the area, drawn by economic opportunities. Some were respectful, willing to coexist peacefully. Others brought prejudice and hostility. We had incidents, confrontations, moments when violence seemed inevitable. But Halion and Kashina consistently chose negotiation over conflict, building relationships with reasonable neighbors while firmly standing against bigotry. By the fall of 1882, two things had become clear. First, the Cheyenne settlement would survive. They'd met the 5-year productive use requirement with 2 years to spare, secured their land rights permanently. Second, Kashina and I had built something neither of us had anticipated when we entered that forced marriage. A real family. Based on mutual respect and shared purpose, and yes, love. Austin looked directly at Owen. I tell you all this because you need to understand that families aren't just born, they're built. You lost your parents. I lost my chance at a conventional life. Kashina lost years to a manufactured curse. We were all broken in different ways. But we chose to build something new from the pieces. Something that didn't erase the past but refused to be defined by it. The fire crackled, sparks rising into the night sky. Tomorrow night, the final part of this story. I'll tell you about the last threat we faced. About how the curse tried one final time to fulfill itself. And about the choice Kashina made that proved once and for all that strength isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to act despite it. For now, sleep. Tomorrow we go home. Owen nodded and settled into his bedroll, but his mind was clearly still processing everything. Austin remained by the fire, remembering that final crisis. The moment when everything they'd built had hung in the balance, and the extraordinary courage that had saved them all. The fifth and final night arrived with the ranch house close enough to touch. Lamplight spilling from windows where Kashina moved with their daughter. Austin had chosen to camp one last time, to finish the story properly before crossing the threshold back into the present. The fire burned bright against the darkness, and Owen sat completely still. Knowing this was the end, what was the final threat? Owen asked quietly. Austin stared into the flames, gathering the last pieces of a story that had defined his life. It came in the spring of 1883, almost 4 years after I first rode into that Cheyenne settlement. We thought we'd weathered every storm, beaten every curse, outlasted every enemy. We were wrong. He poured the last of the coffee, the ritual familiar and centering. March brought unseasonable warmth that year, melting the snowpack faster than the ground could absorb it. The creek swelled, the river rose, and everyone in the valley prepared for spring flooding. It happened most years, manageable if you planned properly. But this year was different. The memory carried weight even now. Aida was 15 months old. walking and talking in that mixture of Cheyenne and English that children raised between cultures naturally develop. She was fearless, constantly escaping supervision to explore, giving both Kashina and me endless worry. On the morning of March 17th, she slipped away while Kashina was working in the garden. Austin's hands tightened around his cup. We didn't notice immediately. Maybe 5 minutes passed before Kashina realized Aida wasn't making noise anymore, which for a toddler is always a warning sign. We searched the house, the barn, the immediate area. Nothing. Then we heard the sound every parent dreads. A child's scream cut short. The panic of that moment was still visceral. We ran toward the creek, which was running high and fast from snowmelt. Aida had wandered to the bank, probably chasing a butterfly or investigating some interesting rock. The ground was soft from moisture, and she'd slipped in. The current had her, dragging her downstream faster than any adult could run. Kashina had reacted instantly. She didn't hesitate, didn't calculate the risk. She dove into that freezing water and swam after our daughter with strength I didn't know she possessed. The current was brutal, the water maybe 40 degrees, filled with debris from upstream. I was running along the bank, trying to keep them in sight, watching the two people I loved most being swept toward the rapids a quarter-mile downstream. Austin's voice went flat, the terror of helplessness bleeding through. I lost sight of them for maybe 30 seconds as they rounded a bend. When I caught up, Kashina had managed to grab Aida, but couldn't fight the current to shore. They were being pulled toward where the creek narrowed through a rocky choke point, waters churning white over submerged boulders. If they hit those rocks at that speed, they'd be killed. He'd had one chance. There was an old cottonwood that had fallen partially across the creek just before the rapids. I ran to it, climbed out over the water, and positioned myself where the current would bring them past. It was a desperate gamble. If I missed the grab, they'd be gone. If I caught them but couldn't hold on, we'd all three go into the rapids together. The moment of impact was seared into memory. Kashina saw me, managed to angle herself in the current. She came past close enough that I could grab her arm with one hand while wrapping my legs around the tree trunk. The force of the water hitting her body and mine nearly tore my shoulder from its socket, but I held on. Held on while she clutched Aida to her chest. Held on while the current tried to rip them away. Held on until two Cheyenne men who'd seen the crisis came running and helped pull us all to shore. They'd collapsed on the muddy bank, coughing up creek water, shaking from cold and adrenaline. Aida was crying, which meant she was breathing, which meant she'd live. Kashina was silent, just holding our daughter and trembling. I was trying to convince my body that the danger had passed, that my racing heart could slow down. We stayed like that for maybe 5 full minutes before anyone could speak. The Cheyenne community had responded with characteristic care. Within an hour, we were all in dry clothes, wrapped in blankets, drinking hot broth that Adzila had prepared. Aida, resilient as only toddlers can be, was already trying to escape supervision again, apparently having learned nothing from nearly drowning. But something had shifted in the settlement's atmosphere. Austin noticed it immediately. People were looking at Kashina strangely. Not with fear exactly, but with a kind of odd concern. The old women were whispering, and their whispers had a tone that made my skin crawl. That evening, Adzila came to our lodge with Julian. Both their faces were serious. What they said had chilled Austin more than the creek water. Adzila spoke first, her voice gentle but firm. She said that Kashina had cheated death twice now, once in the attack on the settlement, once in the creek. The old prophecy, the shaman's curse, had predicted death before the second winter of marriage. We were in our 4th year now, seemingly safe. But Adzila said curses don't die, they hibernate. By saving Aida, Kashina had awakened something that had been waiting. The superstition should have been meaningless. I argued that the curse was proven false, that Greer had fabricated it, that we'd exposed the whole scheme. Hillian agreed with me intellectually, but pointed out something I couldn't dismiss. Belief shapes reality. If enough people believed Kashina was in danger, they'd treat her differently, isolate her again. And the psychological curse would reassert itself, even if the supernatural one was nonsense. Kashina had listened to this discussion in silence. Then she spoke with a clarity that cut through the superstition like a blade. She said, "I spent 6 years letting other people's fear define my life. I spent 6 years being smaller, quieter, more isolated, because the world decided I was cursed. I won't do it again. If death is coming for me, it'll find me living fully." Not hiding in fear, the declaration had been absolute. She announced the next day to the entire settlement that she would no longer acknowledge the curse in any form. She would work, socialize, participate in community life exactly as any other woman would. If people wanted to fear her, that was their choice. But she wouldn't enable it by modifying her behavior. The response had been mixed, some of the younger Cheyenne, especially those who'd grown up seeing Kashina's strength, supported her immediately. The elders were more conflicted, caught between respect for her courage and ingrained belief in shamanic prophecy. A few families, particularly those with small children, began avoiding us again. Austin had watched this division with growing concern. I told Kashina that she didn't have to fight this battle alone, that we could move somewhere else, start fresh where no one knew about the curse. She refused. Side running would be admitting the curse had power. She wanted to break it completely, to prove that a person could define themselves despite what others believed. Then came the incident that forced the final confrontation. In early April, a Cheyenne child fell ill with fever. The mother, a woman named Teanita, had been one of those avoiding Kashina. When the child's condition worsened, Teanita became convinced that Kashina's presence in the settlement had brought sickness as the curse reasserted itself. She demanded at a tribal council meeting that Kashina be asked to leave until the child recovered. The accusation had been devastating, not because it was rational, but because it revealed how easily fear could resurface. Hillian defended his daughter fiercely, pointing out that children got sick regardless of curses, that illness was natural. But Teanita was desperate, grief-stricken, looking for any explanation that gave her control over a terrifying situation. Kashina had made an offer that stunned everyone. She said she would leave the settlement temporarily, not because she believed in the curse, but to give Teanita peace of mind while her child fought the fever. But she made one condition: if the child recovered with her gone, and then fell ill again after she returned, the community would have to acknowledge the curse was real, and she would exile herself permanently. But if the child recovered and stayed healthy after her return, everyone would have to acknowledge the curse was false and never speak of it again. The gamble was enormous. She was betting her entire future on the health of a child she had no control over. But she was also forcing the community to confront their beliefs directly, to make a choice rather than living in perpetual ambiguity. The tribal council agreed to her terms. Kashina, Austin, Aida, and Owen had moved to the ranch house on Austin's land. We stayed there for 2 weeks while the Cheyenne child fought the fever. It was the longest 2 weeks of my life. Every day I expected word that the child had died, that Kashina's gamble had failed. She remained calm throughout, or at least appeared calm. But I'd catch her sometimes staring out at the settlement, her expression unreadable. On the 14th day, a runner came. The child's fever had broken. She was recovering, slowly but steadily. The crisis had passed. But Kashina didn't return immediately. She waited 3 more days, then announced she was going back. I asked if she was certain, reminded her that the second part of the test was whether the child stayed healthy after her return. She said she knew, but hiding longer would be the same as admitting fear. The walk back to the settlement was the longest quarter-mile Austin had ever traveled. Kashina carried Aida. I walked beside her. Owen followed behind. The entire community had gathered, watching in silence as we approached. You could feel the tension, everyone waiting to see what would happen, half expecting lightning to strike or the earth to open up. Nothing happened. We walked into the settlement. Kashina went directly to Tyanita's lodge and asked to see the recovered child. Tyanita hesitated, fear and gratitude warring on her face, then allowed Kashina inside. They were in there for maybe 10 minutes. When Kashina emerged, she was carrying Tyanita's daughter, who was laughing and playing with Aida. The symbolism was perfect. 2 children. One supposedly cursed by association, one supposedly saved by Kashina's absence, playing together without a trace of supernatural interference. Kashina handed the child back to Tyanita and said quietly, "Your daughter is healthy because her body fought off infection, because you cared for her well, because medicine and love did their work. Not because I left, and not because I returned. Just life happening as it does." Tyanita had wept then. She apologized through tears, said fear had made her cruel, that she'd been looking for someone to blame because helplessness was unbearable. Kashina embraced her, said she understood. That fear was human and forgivable as long as we didn't let it define us permanently. That moment broke the curse's final hold. Within a week, families who'd been avoiding us were visiting again. Children played with Aida without their parents intervening nervously. The whispers about supernatural danger faded, replaced by admiration for Kashina's courage. The curse died not because it was proven false through logic, but because enough people chose to stop believing in it. Austin stood and looked toward the ranch house. That was 2 years ago. Since then, we've lived the normal life Kashina always deserved. The ranch prospers. Aida grows stronger every day. The Cheyenne settlement thrives without the shadow of manufactured fear hanging over it. We won, Owen. Not through violence or legal maneuvering, though both played their part. We won because Kashina refused to let other people's fear become her prison. He turned back to the boy. I tell you this story because you're at an age where you'll start making choices about who you want to be. The world will try to define you, put you in boxes, tell you what's possible based on what others believe. Don't let it. Be like Kashina. Acknowledge fear, understand it, but don't worship it. Live fully despite it. Owen was quiet for a long moment, processing everything. Do you love her? He asked finally. Austin smiled. More than I knew I was capable of loving anyone. It started as necessity, became partnership, deepened into something I don't have adequate words for. She's the strongest person I've ever met. And I wake up grateful every morning that circumstances forced us together. The fire was dying now, the night drawing toward dawn. Tomorrow we'll ride into the ranch and you'll see Kashina and Aida again. You'll see the life we built from the ruins of a curse and a forced marriage. Remember this story, Owen. Remember that the world is complicated. That good people sometimes start from desperate circumstances. That love can grow in the strangest soil if you're willing to nurture it. Owen nodded, understanding finally why Austin had spent 5 nights telling this tale. It wasn't just about the past. It was about teaching me how to face the future, the boy said. Exactly. Now sleep. Tomorrow we go home. As Owen settled into his bedroll, Austin remained by the fire, watching the embers glow. In the distance, he could see Kashina's silhouette in the ranch house window, probably watching for them. 4 years ago she'd been called cursed, unmarriageable, a woman to be feared. Now she was a wife, a mother, a leader in her community. And the person who'd taught him that strength wasn't the absence of vulnerability. It was the courage to be vulnerable and keep living anyway. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent witnesses to human struggle and triumph. Somewhere in those same stars, Marcus Greer's schemes had been reduced to dust. His railroad investors had moved on to other territories. and the curse he'd weaponized had been revealed as nothing more than fear given voice. Austin pulled his blanket tight and closed his eyes, ready finally to complete the journey home. The story was told, the lessons delivered, the past honored without being allowed to dominate the present. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight he could rest knowing that he'd kept his promise to Owen's parents, to Halion, to Kashina, and most importantly to himself, to build something good from broken pieces, to choose courage over comfort, and to prove that family wasn't just blood. It was the bonds you chose to forge and honor. In the darkness, the fire died to embers, the Wyoming wind whispered through the grass, and the ranch house waited with its lamps burning. A beacon of home built from determination and hope, and the stubborn refusal to let fear write the ending to anyone's story.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.